Chapter 5 of my book deals with the holy books of Islam, the Qur'an and the Hadith. Both are very closely associated in the Muslim mind with Muhammad, their prophet, and so issues around these texts are just as sensitive as the previous chapter. So when Christians have mistreated or even been accused of mistreating the Qur'an, Muslims become very upset, and even rioted when a maverick American pastor burned copies of it. Confrontational evangelicals see the Qur'an in a totally negative light and have made inflammatory statements about it, with Don Richardson even comparing it to Hitler's Mein Kampf. They point to all the violent verses in it and suggest that Muhammad did not receive revelation from God, but was rather deceived by Satan. Others see a more human source and point to how the Qur'an borrows from other texts and traditions. Again, some suggest that it wasn't written by Muhammad at all, but that it was written later. A few evangelicals have done serious academic work on the history of the Quranic manuscripts, questioning the Muslim story that there has only ever been one unaltered text. Others have written books to explain the Qur'an to Christians and to compare or make connections with the Bible. They also explain how Muslims interpret the Qur'an. The confrontationists focus almost exclusively on the issue of chronology, pointing out that Muslims believe that some later texts abrogate or take the place of earlier texts, and they argue that these later texts tend to be more violent. More conciliatory evangelicals, however, accept that Muslims have other methods of interpretation to deal with this, including looking at the context in which the revelation is said to have been received and comparing it to the general meaning of the Qur'an. That leaves the question of how Christians should read and use the Qur'an. Few Christians read the Qur'an, and it's not an easy book to follow. Of those that do read it, some accept that there is some truth in the Qur'an and that can be a good starting point for talking with Muslims about faith. Other evangelicals strongly disagree with this approach and would only read the Qur'an in order to disprove it and argue against Muslims. The chapter also looks briefly at the Hadith, the collections of all the traditions and sayings of Muhammad. Even fewer Christians have read these, and again a few find some common ground and bridges. However, more use the Hadith for polemical purposes and see them as a problem. They argue that if Islam is to modernize as they see it, then the importance and use of the Hadith will need to be reformed by Muslims. The chapter finishes by pointing out that some evangelicals today are finding it helpful to read the Qur'an and the Bible side by side with Muslims, but that this approach should not involve either community ignoring their difficult texts.